So good day, everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded webinar with Simon Anholt. My name is Simon Chadwick. I'm Professor of Eurasian Sport at EM Lyon Business School in France. I'm joined as well by Dr. Paul Widdop, one of my fellow editors at Geosport and an academic at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. I think it's fair to say that both Paul and I are really excited by today's webinar because we are, as we've already told him, we are big fans of Simon's work and we've referenced a lot of the things that he's doing in many of our recent writings. And I think certainly in terms of diplomacy, international relations, soft power, nation branding, Simon is one of the preeminent experts around the world, and hopefully as we go through the course of today's webinar, you'll find his insights valuable. And what Paul and I are particularly trying to do as we go through this is to understand what this means for sport. So thank you for joining us, Simon. We are really grateful for you for taking part in this. And what I tend not to do in these webinars is introduce people myself, because I inevitably get something wrong, or I get a date wrong, or a detail wrong. And I also like people to say in their own words what it is that they do. So I'm wondering, just for kind of 2 minutes, if you could talk us through who you are and what you do and how you got to this position where you are now.
I was born in 1793.
A year before me.
I was born in 1961, so I'm pretty elderly. What I've spent most of my adult career doing is working as an independent policy advisor to governments around the world, big countries and small, rich and poor. And increasingly over the last 20 years or so, working with the main policymakers, head of state, head of government. And what I've advised on is what I loosely call engagement. So how those countries can relate most productively to the rest of the world. And I suppose the topic that's emerged out of that work most strongly is the necessary challenge for governments to try to harmonize their domestic and their international responsibilities, because that's the way through to a future if we can do that. And it's a big challenge, because the culture of governance, more or less wherever you go, whatever sort of place you're talking about, whatever the political background of the people you're dealing with, there is an assumption that those two things are irreconcilable. Doing the right thing for your own people inevitably means doing some harm to somebody else somewhere else. Doing the right thing for the environment inevitably means slowing down your own economic growth. The consequence of that is that most people in positions of power and authority tend to ignore the bigger system. They tend to ignore the planet, they tend to ignore people outside their own borders. And for a few hundred years, that was probably fine, but it's no longer fine. So that's basically what all of my work is about, trying to think of ways of producing or hurrying along that cultural shift from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative. And I do a bunch of things that try to push towards that. I published something called the Good Country Index, which I've been doing since 2014. That's an annual measurement of approximately how much each country on Earth contributes to the world outside its borders. I do a little provocation called the Global Vote, which is a sort of celebration of our interconnectedness and interdependence. It encourages people around the world to vote on the results of other countries' elections. We're having a lot of fun with the US presidential election at the moment. Biden looks set for a 71% landslide based on votes from outside the USA. And I do something called the Good Leader Index, which is very much an editorial opinion. That's my view on which world leaders are being the goodest and which are being the ungoodest on a month-by-month basis. And so it goes on. So that's the kind of stuff I do.
Okay. So that's a really interesting and appropriate start, Simon, because in terms of the questioning that I made a note of beforehand, it was the Good Countries Index in particular that I wanted to use as the basis for this discussion. Could you talk us through some of the detail of that a little more in terms of, I think we've got a sense already of why you've done this, but maybe if you could elaborate a little further, but also then begin to talk in terms of how have you created the index? And I guess crucially for people who are unfamiliar with the index is which countries are coming out of this well and which countries are coming out of this less well?
Okay, well, just to summarize the reasons for wanting to do it in the first place, I'd done an awful lot of research over the previous 20 years, looking at how people perceive other countries and how those perceptions of other countries feed directly into consumer behavior on a massive scale. So countries with a powerful and positive image trade at a premium. They get more investors, they get more tourists, they grow faster. Countries with weak or negative images find that everything's difficult and everything is expensive. They have to spend twice as much money and try twice as hard to get foreign investment, to get tourists, to get talent. And what I suppose this showed to me over the years was that country image is no trivial matter. It's actually very significantly responsible for the increasing global inequality, because rich countries obviously have the advantage of a positive image driving everything they do. Poor countries not only have to tackle weak institutions and a weak economy, they also have to battle constantly against the headwind of a weak reputation. And it makes everything twice as hard and tends to push the rich and the poor worlds further and further apart. So around about 2014, 2012 more like, I realized that I'd been measuring country images for a long time. And I'd collected more than 1 billion data points by this stage of consumer polling. And it occurred to me that it would be really interesting to try and find out actually where does a good national image come from? Because I'd discovered pretty categorically that it was nothing to do with propaganda. The amount of money that governments spend on promoting their own countries doesn't correlate at all with the strength of their image. Yes, if you do a lot of advertising, you might get more tourists, but it doesn't improve the image of the country. And so to cut a long story short, I did an analysis of the accumulated database of all the consumer polling I'd done up until that point, and discovered to my surprise that by a wide margin, the most significant driver of a positive national image and all the benefits that brings was the perception that a country contributes something to the world outside its own borders. In other words, a country that people just feel glad that it exists. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. How do people know? Because I don't think I would know whether a country was good or selfish. I couldn't possibly tell you which countries contribute more to the rest of the world. So I thought maybe we could try and measure it. So I basically spent a year or two trying to collect all of the available data, not polling data. This is not a perceptions index. This is a measurement of actual national behavior. To try and find as many tokens, if you like, of whether countries contribute to the world outside their own borders or whether they don't in as many areas as possible. And in the end, my colleagues and I found about 35 good, robust data sets, mostly from the UN system, which measure in various different ways what is the impact of each country on Earth outside its own borders. We completely ignore the domestic factors, not because they're unimportant, of course they're important, but they're measured in so many other places so thoroughly and so well, there's just no point in me adding to all of that good research that's already out there. If you want to know how well a country performs in terms of prosperity, equality, transparency, corruption, productivity, it's all out there. But somehow or other in this age of massive interconnectedness and interdependence, nobody had ever tried to measure before what the external impact of countries was. So we basically created a composite index which uses those 35 indicators to create a series of 7 sub-rankings and an overall ranking. So the overall ranking basically says, how good is this country? What is its net contribution to the world outside its own borders? And the sub-rankings look at that in terms of categories like peace and security, environment and climate, and you can easily imagine what the 7 are. You asked about the results. Well, in some ways, they're a mixture of surprising and unsurprising. Every now and again, there's a nice surprise. In the first edition of the index, which I published in 2014, there were two nice surprises. One was that Ireland came top, which was unexpected. Relative to the size of its economy, most of the indicators are normalized by GDP. This is just to create a more level playing field. We did try lots of other normalizations, including GNI, population, and so on and so forth, but they all turned out pretty much the same. And GDP turned out to be a good way of doing it. So relative to the size of its economy, Ireland at that point did more for the rest of the world outside its borders than any other country. The other nice surprise was that Kenya ranked within the top 30, which was very important to me because it proved something I was very keen to prove, that this isn't about money. This isn't based on the usual concept of Victorian philanthropy that all the world's ills are about there not being enough money south of the equator and there being too much spare money north of the equator. And if only the rich countries could give enough of their spare money to the poor countries, then all the world's problems would vanish. I don't buy that narrative at all. I think it does almost as much harm as it does good. And what I wanted to measure was engagement with the international system, with as little of that being financial or economic as possible. In fact, only 2 or 3 of the 35 indicators are really directly about money. Most of the others are about other things entirely. And the fact that Kenya managed to do so well shows that even, for example, receiving aid is a way of engaging with the international system. It's not about donating necessarily. Just using the opportunities that are available for countries in the modern world to benefit from the good parts of globalization. It's a clumsy way of putting it. That's kind of where I'm at.
Okay.
So that's, in a nutshell, what the index is all about. I'm just about to release the edition 1.4. I call them 1.3, 1.4, and so on and so forth, because if you refer to them by the year in which they're published, it's slightly misleading because the data is normally about 2 or 3 years old by the time it's all available and published. So a message to the many, many thousands of angry Americans who write to me complaining about the fact that the USA is only in 40th place, which I think is a pretty good place, actually, and accusing me of being anti-Trump. Actually, those numbers came from Obama, not from Trump.
So that's it. That's one of the secrets of the next edition, that America is still around that position in the ranking.
You'll have to wait and see, not because I'm being secretive, but because I can't remember.
Anything else that you could give us some insights looking ahead to its publication that we should be looking out for?
It's the Good Country Index is a great deal more volatile, actually, than my other big study, the Nation Brands Index. The Nation Brands Index is this big consumer poll of perceptions of countries, which is astonishingly invariable. It's the most boring social survey ever published. I mean, people just never change their minds about countries from one year to the next. On the other hand, countries really do behave differently from year to year, depending on, whether they're participating in a UN peace initiative or what have you. So they do move around all over the place. The Nordic countries and Western European countries still dominate the top of the index. And no, I didn't do that deliberately. Those really are the numbers. And I think it's highly likely that we'll probably get another Nordic country in the top positions. We will get other Nordic countries in the top positions, as we do almost every year since Ireland and the very first one. And the reason for that is pretty clear. It's not because I'm biased. I can't affect the results. I can't put my finger on the scale because the calculations are completely transparent. We just take the UN data and stick it together. No, I think the reason is because the Nordic countries have a long tradition of cooperation and collaboration. They understand the benefits of working closely together. For all kinds of historical reasons, they've needed to do that under pressure from climate and foreign invasion and lack of resources and so forth. And they are a particularly collaborative subgroup within a highly collaborative experiment, the European Union. And consequently, those European and especially Nordic countries just know better than most other countries what the benefits are of working with your neighbors and those further afield. The ones who haven't tried it don't know.
It's interesting that you mentioned there your Nation Brand Index, because I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about nation branding. And again, please feel free to talk us through the index. But could you, really two things. Could you talk us through when you refer to nation branding, what is that? I think obviously a lot of people are familiar with consumer brands, the kind that you find in a garage somewhere or in a supermarket.
Yeah.
But applied to nations, it starts to become a little different. So something about nation branding, but also, and I'm hoping to get your insights and clarifications around differences between nation branding and soft power. Because I think sometimes people conflate these things, but clearly they're different, but there's a relationship between them.
Yeah, I actually really dislike the term nation branding, and generally speaking have tried to avoid using it for many years. It's very misleading. As I often say, the term that I'm often accused of having invented is actually nation brand. And it sounds very fussy, but the three letters really do make a difference. Nation brand, when I coined the term in an academic, not very academic paper, back in whenever it was, in the 1990s, was simply an observation that in this age of advanced globalization, all countries, in fact all places, have got a certain image in the minds of the people who live there and the people who don't live there. And those images are incredibly important today because they drive, as I was saying before, all kinds of economically, socially, and politically important phenomena, like migration, like foreign investment, like tourism, like cultural relations. And that observation really didn't extend back then to suggesting there was anything you could do about this. I merely pointed out that the countries that had good images had a huge advantage in the modern age. What happened, and I failed to notice it for a very long time, was that people, the idea caught on, people liked it. They liked the idea that, you know, you could compare a country's image to the brand image of a product. And I suppose the consequent assumption that the world had turned with globalization into a kind of gigantic supermarket in which the countries were just products on the shelf that you as a footloose consumer choose from when you're deciding, where am I going to live, where am I going to study, where am I going to go on holiday, which country am I going to hire people from, which country am I going to buy products from, whose culture do I engage with. And it sounded a bit cynical and a bit wicked, and I think that's why people liked it. That wasn't in my intention at all. I was actually being a little bit wry about it. I just thought, what a shame that these vastly complex, rich cultural constructs have actually become little more than just signals for consumers. But there you go. That's one of the consequences of globalization. But anyway, gradually, it started turning into nation branding, and I didn't notice that. But of course, nation branding suggests something very different. It sounds like a promise. It sounds like you're saying to governments, by the way, if you don't like the image your country has got, then you can fix it. And there's a mysterious closed box of tools called branding, which you can use to manipulate public perceptions. And I suppose the next logical assumption that people might make is, if only they could raise the marketing budget of a Nike or a Coca-Cola, then they could have a brand like Nike or Coca-Cola within a matter of what, months, weeks, who knows? And the consequence of that careless vocabulary and careless talk is that, of course, the whole world's communications industry, the ad agencies, the media owners, the design agencies, the branding agencies, the digital marketing agencies, all leapt onto this bandwagon because it suddenly suggested to them the opening of a vast new marketplace containing not just corporate wealth, but sovereign wealth. And, you know, who wants Coca-Cola if you can have Saudi Arabia? And so all of these communications agencies have been piling in, peddling branding to governments for 20 years or so. And nobody has noticed, or perhaps they have noticed and cared not to mention it, apart from me, that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that any of these techniques have any impact. They just don't. And if you ask governments, why are you doing this? They say, well, because everybody else does. which is a little bit like saying eat shit 3 trillion flies can't be wrong. You know, it's it's just, call me old fashioned, but I think when governments are spending taxpayers' money on anything at all, it needs to be transparent, measurable and accountable. And yet somehow when it comes to spending millions, tens of millions, sometimes over years, hundreds of millions of dollars on bragging about how wonderful your country is, they should have a model that shows that this actually works and that they're not simply giving all of that money away to media owners and marketing executives. Mm-hmm. Anyway, forgive me, I got a little carried away, but it is a bit of a scandal really, because if you add up the amount of taxpayers and donors' money that gets wasted every year, it's just a siphon for transferring taxpayers and donors' money from the public sector to the hands, to the pockets of media companies. And that's pretty scandalous because it really doesn't work. The Nation Brands Index, as I said, over the years has collected more than 1 billion data points, and there is absolutely zero correlation between how much countries spend on branding and their images. Nothing on earth can actually deliberately change their image. There are a few things you can do to make it much worse relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. For example, if you encourage your newspapers, which Denmark didn't do, but if you did want to do this on purpose, you could encourage your newspapers to publish outrageous cartoons lampooning important figures from another culture's religion. That would damage your image, and that's what happened to Denmark after the infamous cartoons were published back in 2016. It still hasn't recovered since 2006. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's the Nation Brands Index. It really is a fascinating topic. The process or the task or the job of nation branding, I'm much less certain about. I don't think it exists. When governments ask for my advice on how they can improve the image of their country, my advice is pretty standard. I say, do something to make people feel glad that you exist, and then keep doing it. Mm. And then you might find over time that people are actually glad that you exist. Or to put it even more simply, if you want to be admired, be admirable. I don't know any other way of doing it. Condoleezza Rice once said, the diplomacy of deeds, and that I think is a really good expression for describing what I'm talking about. Propaganda just cannot work internationally. It works domestically, very sadly. If you control all the channels of communication reaching your end user, which Kim Jong-un can still do up to a point, then experience shows that over time people will just give up. They will just end up believing the only story they've ever heard or their parents or grandparents have ever heard. We know that propaganda works in these contexts, but internationally it doesn't. In fact, all the evidence from media studies is that the harder a country tries to push a particular narrative of its own choice, the harder the pushback will be from others. And there are 1,000 voices you can't control out there, no matter how much money you spend. I don't believe in nation branding. I think it's a waste of money, and I think it's a foolish distraction from the real jobs of government.
And so soft power, or how would you characterize soft power?
Well, soft power's different. I think that Joseph Nye's original observations are of significant value in helping us to understand the forces that shape the world that we live in today. I don't especially like the construct simply because it's still about power. And whether you want to praise soft power as being somehow more kind, more genteel, less damaging than hard power, of course, that's absolutely fine. But as a recipe for the way that countries behave, you're still pushing the idea that ultimately what they need to achieve is some form of ascendancy over other countries. And I think that that is the thing that we need to question today. As an analysis of the way that the world works, I think it's genius. But as a recipe or a prescription for how countries should behave, I think it's very dangerous, because it keeps them on this track of feeling that they've got to find ways of achieving ascendancy over other countries. And that is nonsense. I often say that I don't really have a problem. I'm not scandalized when Donald Trump says America first. It seems to me to be a statement of the obvious. If you're elected to run a country, then of course it goes without saying that your primary concern should be the well-being of your own citizens. And of course you should prioritize the interests of your own country over the interests of other countries. But what I find depressing about the Trump interpretation of this old line is that he seems to think the only way that America could come first is by everybody else coming last. And that's the danger. It's not true. America, of all countries, has been one of the most energetic at trying to prove over the centuries that it's possible for you to come first and help others aspire to coming first, or first equal, or very nearly. And all ships are raised by the same tide, and that's the way to do life on Earth. It's not a sprint to the finish where there's one winner and a whole bunch of losers. It's a team sport, and the sooner we all realize that, the better.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was particularly taken by your sentence there. Which would you prefer, Coca-Cola or Saudi Arabia? Whilst I ruminate on that, and I could ruminate for a considerable amount of time on that observation, Paul, can I invite you to
yes, certainly, Simon.
To talk to Simon.
Thanks, Simon. These are fascinating insights, and it's a pleasure to sit in your company. I've got just a couple of questions. I'd love to get your opinion on. How do you feel like a nation's history and also its geographical location is important for nation branding and the Good Country Index?
Interesting and different questions. I noticed you were talking about nation branding. Of course, you're most welcome to. I'm not going to, because I don't think it means anything. But obviously the history of a country is a very important part of the way that it's perceived today. Humanity has a long collective memory, and I suppose one of the arguments that I've tried to put across over the years is that national image is not a superficial, trivial, or short-term phenomenon. It is, as I think I said earlier, a vast cultural construct. It's not something that's purely created by the media in most cases. I mean, of course, there are examples of countries that people knew absolutely nothing about until they hit the news. And in those cases, yes, it is the media that creates the image, but most countries are not like that. Most countries, there's some kind of collective memory of how those countries have behaved over the centuries, over the generations. And that is a very, very important part of that cultural construct. We imbibe our views about other countries from the society around us, from our parents and our teachers and our schools. And the media is just one example of that. One of the reasons why PR agencies have done very well out of the idea of nation branding is because their pitch is actually appears to be a very logical one. What you do is you go to a government and you say, look at your terrible image. And they say, yes, we know, nobody understands us, nobody loves us, everybody underestimates us, they've got all the wrong facts about us. Every country says this. You know, from Finland to Syria, it makes no difference, they all say it. And then you say to them, I don't say it, but the PR agencies say, well, look at what they're saying about you on the internet. Look at what they're saying about you in the newspapers. It's not surprising, is it? All of this disinformation. That's why people don't know the truth about you. And at this point, the government says, my gosh, you're right. It's the media. It's the media. And then the PR agency will say, well, we're a PR agency. What we do is we have ways of persuading the media to cover you in a more positive way. We need to buy them a lot of lunches, but we have great connections with them and we can tell the real story. And then people will start finding out what you're really like and what you're really good at. One hardly knows where to start with that. It seems so logical and so many governments fall into that trap. But the reality is that it's based on two lies. The first lie is that a PR agency can influence the media. It can't. Even the biggest and most expensive and best paid PR agency in the world can't do more than create tiny temporary blips in the way that the media peddles out the same traditional narratives about countries. The media lives and survives on cliches about other countries, on nation brands. The stories of the international stories in newspapers and websites are basically the same old cliches peddled over and over and over and over again. The second lie that it's based on is the idea that the media can change people's perceptions about countries. And as I mentioned before, it was known way back in the 60s in media studies that the media doesn't have that power in most cases. There's remarkably little correlation between the way that the media talks about countries and the way that people then perceive them. And governments and PR agencies often deliberately or accidentally push the two together as if they were the same thing, but they're not. The media, generally speaking, does not create opinions. It reflects opinions. And it doesn't create prejudices, it reflects prejudices. That's its business model. That's how it can sell advertising, by reflecting back on people what they already believe about things. And if it suddenly starts saying new things that are different from people's prejudices, people will just change media. They won't change their minds. So I think that that's all just to say, really, that if a government really does feel that it's important for it to start tackling the way that it's perceived around the world, then it has to look well beyond the media, and it has to look well beyond public relations. And it does need to start thinking about history, as you say, and culture and geography. How far away are you? Exoticism, for example, is purely a function of geographical distance. Liverpool is just as exotic to somebody in Shanghai as Shanghai is to somebody in Liverpool. These are imponderably complex factors, and they all feed into it. Your other question about to what extent those factors, history, geography, and so forth, impact the Good Country Index is kind of, for me, is a different question. Because this isn't about perceptions, this is about reality. And of course, how does the history of a country affect its present reality? Well, in every single way that you could possibly imagine. And one of the challenges that I made to the Good Country Index fairly early on was to what extent our country's position in the Good Country Index, even though I'm only measuring a single point in time right now, to what extent are they in fact simply the consequences of historical factors, obviously to an enormous extent. And my colleague Robert Govis and I did attempt to do as a kind of experiment a decolonized version of the Good Country Index, where we basically removed all of the factors that might plausibly be the consequence of recent colonization within the last 100 years or so. It did make some quite interesting differences to the ranking, as I expected it would. Nothing absolutely dramatic. It didn't turn the whole thing upside down. But the reality of the matter is that even some of these year-by-year measurements that we're using in the Good Country Index, they do reflect structural differences between countries. And those structural differences are very much the consequence of history. Of course, I get dozens of people every week writing to me and saying, how can you rank Germany so high in the Good Country Index if you never heard of Adolf Hitler? And I always reply by saying, yes, of course I've heard of Adolf Hitler, but how could I possibly make this historical? How could you even do that? The statistics we use don't even go back more than about 5 years in any reliable way. And it would become an entirely subjective exercise. And anyway, how do you penalize the Germans of today for the Holocaust perpetrated by their grandparents and great-grandparents? Who decides how many points you take away for something like that? It would become entirely subjective. And anyway, that's an easy one because everybody knows that the Holocaust was a terrible thing. What about all the difficult, subtle ones? You just leave them out. But the most interesting challenge of all, if you're performing this intellectual exercise, is okay. So let's say we do decide that we're going to do this on a historical basis. When does history begin? Where's the cutoff point? Because even if you could find the data, and even if you did have the resources to include all of that data, almost no country on earth is guilt-free. You just have to go back a little bit further. And wherever I decided that the random cutoff point would be when history began and I start my measurement, somebody would write to me and say, you deliberately chosen 1438 because in 1437, this country perpetrated this horrendous crime against humanity, and that's why you're excluding it. You could never win. And in a more realistic way, this is why I have relatively little sympathy for arguments about historical guilt that are based on random cutoff points. Why do we only go back a certain distance? Why do we only go back to the Second World War? Why do we only go back to the beginning of the European empires? Is it really true? It's getting kind of philosophical, of course, it has to. But is it true that crimes become somehow less heinous just because they took place a long time ago? Why should they? That's illogical. And yet, when you talk to Indians about the difference between the British Empire and the Chola Empire 600 years earlier, which were of a different size, but equally wicked in the sense that they were based on the idea of going and seizing other people's land to which you had no right. Why is one worse than the other? Is it just because it's a fresher memory? Is it just because it's on a grander scale? I don't know. So one has to avoid it because otherwise you just can't even start.
Could I move us across from what is just an amazing, as you rightly pointed out, it's not only complex but enormously interesting area, and kind of gently move into something that is of specific interest to Paul and me. I think there's about another 700 or 800 webinars in what you've just talked about, but we're just going to have to leave them to one side for the moment. And if we start with or go back to what we started with, the Good Country Index, and ask a very simple question: in what ways and to what extent is sport part of what you're looking at when you're creating the index?
Do you know, it's a funny thing, Simon, but I don't think there are any sport indicators in the Good Country Index. I need to go back and check. It may be that in some of the culture ones, there are numbers there that do refer to sport. Yeah. I think perhaps there should be. Well, we've got these 35 data sets, and people have been sending me a constant stream of suggestions, not always accompanied by abuse, for other data sets that we could and should include, because they are ways of measuring what a country contributes to the world and what it doesn't. I don't remember us ever actually looking for sport data. And maybe this is something we could talk about offline. If there was an indicator there that was available for all those countries, 160 plus, that was regular, robust, and reliable, and published every year, and that doesn't only cover a small number of countries and therefore unfairly penalize the rest, but that measured how much a country contributes to international sport, I think that would be really valuable, because sport is a contribution to the commons. Just like any other form of culture, it's good because it's good for people's souls. It is a way of, well, I'm telling you things that you already know. It's a way of exercising the inherent qualities of competitiveness and tribalism that are instinct in our nature in relatively harmless ways. And like many people, I feel that if we didn't have those harmless ways, those elements of our character wouldn't go away. They'd just explode in less welcome ways, as indeed they still do. So sport is key. Once again, I think it's misconceived as soft power, because then you're still looking at ways of hitting other countries over the head or achieving ascendancy over them. And that's harmless when it's metaphorical, when it's in a sporting metaphor. I want to score more goals than Cameroon, fine. But if I want to achieve more profile for my glorious nation than Cameroon by spending more money on bigger events, it seems pretty harmless, but it's part of an attitude towards international relations, towards the international community, which is fundamentally harmful and is fundamentally the reason why we're facing so many challenges in the modern age. So we need to learn from sport. I often come back, and I mentioned it in my book, which I just published. It's called The Good Country Equation, and what it tries to do is to summarize all of these arguments in one sort of reasonably digestible form. And I talk about this thing that I sometimes call the Olympic gene, which is a gene somewhere inside all of us that lights up when it's in the presence of cultural diversity. I fundamentally believe that at a deep, deep, deep level, there are no racists. At a deep, deep level, people are fascinated by difference. And I think that's almost universal, almost universal. And I call it the Olympic gene because if you're ever at the opening ceremony of the Olympics and you watch the audience instead of the arena, when the country teams are parading around the edge of the arena and they're holding their banners, bearing the name of their country. And by the way, I'm so glad that Macedonia can now be letter N for North Macedonia instead of T for the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. What an insult that was. You look at the audience and there's not a dry eye in the house. And everybody is visibly moved by the spectacle of benign nationalism. From the little brave countries holding their banners and it's the name of somewhere you've never even heard of before, you didn't think it was a country, right the way through to the superpowers. It's profoundly moving. And I think that pretty much every single human being has got that gene that lights up in the presence of that kind of diversity, that they look so different and yet suddenly you realize they're the same. And if we could just code that gene, I think it's probably got the answer inside it, are the answers to most of the problems that we're facing today.
I know that you work with a number of countries, and I'm not going to ask you about them specifically, but if I could just take one country, Saudi Arabia, and as I say, who you don't work for, just to be clear about that. I find Saudi Arabia interesting in my world because Saudi Arabia is now committed to policy and strategy that essentially is focused upon positioning this country as an event destination, a sport event destination. And we've seen boxing bouts taking place there. The Paris-Dakar Rally has taken place there this year. Next year, it looks like there's going to be a Formula One Grand Prix there for the first time, and so on and so forth. Yet at the same time, obviously, this is a hugely controversial country for several reasons that has led some observers to label Saudi Arabia as being a sport washer. So in other words, laundering its image, laundering its reputation, distracting attention away from broader crimes and misdemeanors. And I don't know to what extent you have a view on Saudi Arabia, but what's your view on sport as a means through which to divert, to wash, to launder, or do you see sport as being something genuine and legitimate and very different to this? It's actually about getting people running and jumping and hosting events and bringing groups together. What's your view on all of this? And as I say, if you feel you can comment on Saudi Arabia specifically, please do so. But maybe even in a broader context, it might be helpful.
Well, first of all, I don't think there's anything inherently genuine about sport any more than there's anything inherently genuine about any other form of cultural production or activity. There's little doubt that the majority of the people who are actually doing it, the athletes, the musicians, what have you, they are almost certainly doing it genuinely because they believe in it and because they love it, and it's because it's their calling and their vocation. Unfortunately, it's not up to the performers and the athletes. It's up to the people who make use of it, governments and businesses. And of course, there is absolutely no certainty that sport or culture are being used for genuine purposes. They can be used for propagandistic purposes just as anything else can. Cultural relations, we could be having an almost parallel conversation about cultural relations. Sport, like culture, appeals these days to governments who want to put out a certain message to themselves because there is a tendency on the part of the general public to want to believe that it's genuine because of its association with these powerful and genuine emotions that it brings up. And that's why it's valuable. And that's why the whole concept of soft power has become so valuable. It's why it's such a big money area, because people have realized, governments have realized, power brokers have realized, gosh, people believe this stuff. Now, that doesn't prevent it being abused and exploited, which it is continuously. Yeah. As to the question of how genuine Saudi Arabia is being about this, how can I possibly know? How can anybody possibly know? I personally find that the older I get, the more impatient I am with this habit of questioning people's motivations for doing things. I think it's impertinent. I can't know their motivations any more than they could know my motivations. And, you know, if somebody from Saudi Arabia started lecturing me about my reasons for wanting to do the work I do, and saying that my motivations were impure, I'd be rightly furious. And I'd say, how the hell do you know? Okay. And in the same way, I really don't know. On the face of it, I think it looks really encouraging, because here's a country that, after all, has been pretty much closed to the world for the best part of a century and is now opening up. How can that be a bad thing? And even if there is some element of calculation in this, which of course there must be, because governments have to calculate, that's their job. Does that mean that the thing is somehow invalid? I don't think it does. I think that there can be mixed motivations for doing things. The important thing is that they're done if they're good things. And in the same way, I get very impatient with people who spend their time lecturing corporations for doing corporate social responsibility for reasons that they, the protesters, regard as being improper. You know, you're only closing that sweatshop in Bangladesh because you're afraid of the negative PR if you leave it open. Well, who cares? I mean, the world is in an emergency situation at the moment, and we need large, powerful organizations, corporations, countries, cities, regions, to start doing things that are actually going to guarantee us a future. And right now, I don't even want to ask whether they're doing it for the right reasons or not. I just want to know they're doing it because it's a damn sight better than not doing it, or, as in the case with Donald Trump, actually trying to discourage other people from doing it, which is doubly damaging. In any case, doing things for the wrong reason, doing them for entirely cynical reasons, can often inspire many others to do similar things because they sense that that's the direction. It creates a sense that this is where things are going. And powerful players like Saudi Arabia are creating an enormous benefit to the human community by helping along this idea that holding big sporting events, being open, being generous, inviting foreigners to come visit your country, to participate in friendly activities with you. All of that, those are good messages. And even if they're not 100% sincerely meant, I don't know. But even if they're not, it doesn't matter, because other people will follow suit, because that's the way human beings are. And the ones who follow suit may well do it for the right reasons. But right reasons or wrong reasons, who cares, as long as they're doing it? And there's a funny quirk in human nature that I've noticed over and over and over again. Very often I've seen organizations, and sometimes cities and regions as well, start doing, quote, the right thing for, quote, the wrong reasons, purely to boost their share price or whatever it may be. And then a funny thing happens. It works, in the sense that people start respecting them for what they're doing. And the moment the decision makers in those organizations start feeling that sensation, the warmth of the admiration of the public on them, they become addicted to it, and they can't live without it. And from that point onwards, they will do anything, literally anything, if it only means that they continue to receive that admiration that they've become addicted to. And if the only way they can continue to receive it is by being genuinely good, then they'll even become genuinely good if that's what it costs. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to be patient. We have to be very, very patient. There's one other thing I wanted to say about Saudi Arabia in this context. Many, many years ago, when I still used to use the word brand rather a lot, I remember saying a particular sentence quite frequently, which was, your brand is not your message. It's the context in which your message is received. And I think that this is what Saudi Arabia are experiencing at the moment. If a generally admired or liked nation was saying the same things and doing the same things as Saudi Arabia, the motivations wouldn't be questioned. You know, if it was Sweden, nobody would be saying, oh, you're just offering to hold the Winter Olympics in Stockholm because you want people to admire you. They'll just say, oh, isn't it great, Sweden being welcoming again? The problem with Saudi Arabia's negative image is that everything they do good or bad, is likely to be interpreted in the same key. And whatever they do that's good, it will be adduced as further evidence for their, whatever it is, for their perceived wickedness. And that's why this is such a huge challenge. And this is the message that I always try to get across to governments. You've got to understand this isn't a bad image that means that you've got to send good messages. Your bad images means that your good messages become bad messages. Your good deeds are perceived as bad deeds. And that's the challenge. And that's why it's so very, very, very difficult to shift.
Paul, I know that you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, my question is, again, it's for these countries that invest in sporting institutions and infrastructures in foreign countries. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on whether, if, say, a country that ranks high in some of these indexes that you have, is there any way that a country who doesn't rank so high can diffuse some of that perceived image of that country onto reflecting on their own image by investing in these cultural institutions, not just football, but other cultural institutions right throughout what we know is like, say, for example, in Paris and Qatar, where Qataris are investing heavily in cultural institutions. I was sure any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's a dangerous assumption which has probably been perpetrated by the marketing agencies, that doing this kind of stuff is necessarily very expensive, and that the amount of money you spend is directly correlated to the amount of image you can buy for your country. And my experience is that it just doesn't work like that. People expect big, rich countries to make big, expensive gestures. And because it's expected, it doesn't really have very much impact. Because people look at it and they say, well, we know you've got loads of money. And then, yeah. In fact, it can be counterproductive, because if people are frightened of another country because they think that it's dangerously powerful, because it has hard power, because it has a big economy, actually, the more money they spend, the more frightening they become, even if they're spending that money on good, nice things. So, you know, there's a risk. For example, one of the things I noticed when Russia hosted the football men's World Cup was that a lot of people in my research was saying, effectively, I'm even more scared of Russia than before, because look how much money they're spending on this. It's almost exactly as if they were spending it on one of those military parades in Red Square. The message to poor countries and to rich countries is that this isn't necessarily about money. It's actually got an awful lot more to do with imagination. And imagination, or as I sometimes call it, creativity. Creative is another difficult word. For me, creative is just the opposite of boring. That's all it means. If you're able, and this is difficult for governments, if you're able to be the opposite of boring, then even very small, even very cheap actions, projects, initiatives can have a profound effect. I mean, Bhutan didn't spend any money on promoting the idea of gross national happiness. It was just the right idea at the right moment, landing in the flow of human culture at precisely the right time. And there are plenty of examples of smaller and poorer countries that have seized the world's imagination because they've done something extraordinary, not expensive. The Maldives decided to have a cabinet meeting underwater, all wearing scuba diving equipment, just to dramatize the fact that in a few years their island would be underwater. That didn't cost them anything. It went around the world in about a day. Now, that's a publicity stunt, and publicity stunts don't achieve very much. The difficult thing is not doing it once. The difficult thing is presenting a continuous flow of dramatic evidence that you are the country that you want people to understand that you are. That's the challenge. Most governments just don't have the stamina or the energy, let alone the creativity, to maintain this over a long period. And elected governments obviously aren't in power for very long. And by the time they've started getting the idea of how to do this, it's too late. Somebody else takes over and tears up everything that they've done. So it's very, very challenging. But the wonderful thing about creativity and sport is that they are natural, free expressions of the human spirit. And therefore, there is no reason why they can't be done to an extraordinary level that captures people's attention around the world and doesn't involve a huge amount of money. And the other thing that's worth saying just very briefly is that in both fields of sport and culture, the wonderful thing is that there is also anyway a huge variety of different ways that countries can engage. You know, you don't have to host the Olympics. You can host IOC meetings, or you can have your own athletics competition. And what I always find myself saying to governments is, if you can't find a ready-made event out there that you think is going to help your image, then start a new one, for heaven's sake. There's no rule that says you can't do that. And all it needs is a good original idea, somebody with the wit just to say, how come nobody ever thought of doing this before? And then in 10 years' time, it'll be a national treasure, and everybody will say, oh, we could never do one of those. But you can.
Thank you, Simon. I want to round off today by providing some conclusions, and to, I guess, on that basis, to ask a very simple question: if you were contacted by a country this afternoon and asked to provide, you know, the kind of list of top 3 or top 5 things that they should be doing in considering how to promote their position within the Good Countries Index, or whether it was seeking to build soft power influence around the world, or merely to enhance their reputation, you know, what kind of 3 or 5 things short, sharp things would you say to these people?
Well, the first and most important one is one that I've said already, which is the fundamental fact in all of this, which is, if you want to be admired, you have to be admirable. So don't think about what you've done in the past. Don't think about sending out messages. You know, the number of governments who ring me and say, what can we say to make ourselves famous? And I say, wrong question. The question is, what can we do to make ourselves relevant? Okay. So that's, you know, that's thing number one. It's what you're going to do. It's not what you're going to say about who you are or where you've come from. Oh gosh, it's after that point, it becomes really hard to choose. I think perhaps another really, really important message, and one that's very often ignored or overlooked or never mentioned, is that there's no rule that says you have to do this on your own. Every country is part of an international community, and that community is facing the same challenges. It's facing common challenges. And this idea that even poor, weak, small countries somehow have to fight a fight on their own and get ahead of as many other countries as they possibly can, it's not only a misconception about the nature of the international community, it's also tremendously unlikely to produce anything good. I would suggest that any country that wants to engage more productively with the international community, to move in from the margins, if it feels it's at the margins, is to just get a big flip chart and write down on the first page, what are all the things that keep people awake at night these days? Climate change, migration, pandemics, and so on and so forth. You'll probably find that there are 30 or so of them. And then just sit down with all your brightest colleagues from government, from civil society, from business, whatever you want, academia, and just work your way through that list and say, which one or ones of those could we hope to make a meaningful difference if we really set our minds to it? And of course, not alone, right? So Djibouti might well look at that list and say climate change, okay? Because that means a lot to us. We're going to suffer from climate change. But the idea of Djibouti doing something for the whole planet that's going to significantly help the fight against climate change is difficult. But Djibouti doesn't have to do it on its own, and can't do it on its own, and mustn't do it on its own. So the question becomes not what can we do, but how can we work with others to collectively achieve these things? And the misunderstanding of many governments is that if you share it with other people, you're also sharing the glory. Actually, that's not the way it works. People also judge you by the company you keep. And so if Djibouti were to ring up Sweden, Costa Rica, and Greenland and say, let's form a temporary team and see if we can do something about climate change together, because we represent the 4 corners of the earth and very different stages of economic development and so on and so forth. They're not going to say no. They're going to say, that sounds interesting. And the combination of 5 unexpected countries doing something that everybody really wants doing teaching the world something that it wants to learn, fixing something that the world thinks is broken, that's so much more interesting than 5 times 5 countries doing it individually. And so there's plenty of glory to go around. And I suppose, actually, I'll make it 3. The third and last piece of advice is just don't ever think about or talk about your image or your reputation. Just park it. It's not a suitable topic for governments to be worrying about. What you need to be worrying about is doing the right thing. And if you do the right thing, if you harmonize your domestic and your international responsibilities, you figure out ways of doing the right thing for your own people and your own slice of territory, while at the same time doing no harm to other people's people and other people's territory, or even doing them good, then you will find that your image is going to improve without you even thinking about it. The moment you start thinking about image, you become a sad loser and people can detect it.
Simon Anholt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon.
And thanks, Paul, for being alongside me to ask the questions today.